The invitation lay on the scuffed oak table like a judgment. Gilt-edged and smelling of expensive ink, it requested the pleasure of Miss Constance Abbott's company at a ball held at Kestrel Chase, the seat of Gideon Devereux, the Duke of Iron. Her aunt, Lavinia Hollis, held her breath, her fingers clutching a porcelain teacup so tightly the knuckles shone like polished bone. It was the 50th such invitation the Duke had issued over 2 seasons, each to a different eligible lady of the county, and it was the first to bear Constance's name. "Well?" Lavinia's voice was a sharp, impatient thing. "This is it, the last one. He has rejected every girl of note. Philippa Crane, the vicar's daughter, even the baronet's eldest. Now it is your turn." Constance looked not at the card, but at the faint ring of water damage on the table beneath it, a ghost of some past spill she had long since scrubbed away. She was 24, a creature of grey dresses and mended gloves, her only notable features a pair of steady, observant eyes and a memory as unforgiving as a banker's ledger. "I shall not be attending," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The teacup clattered into its saucer. "What did you say?" "The Duke requires a duchess. He is inspecting candidates. I am not a candidate for a coronet, Aunt. I am the woman who ensures your butcher's bill is paid and that Felicity's lace is properly starched. Let us not pretend otherwise." "Do not be a fool, Constance," Lavinia hissed, her face mottling with color. "This is not a request, it is a summons. The man is a duke. He has worked his way through every presentable girl in Marley and the surrounding parishes. You are the only one left. It is an act of desperation on his part and an opportunity for us." Us. The word hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unpaid bills and dwindling funds from a trust Constance's father had left. A trust Lavinia was draining like a vampire at a vein, all to fund the social ambitions of Constance's younger, prettier sister, Felicity. "Felicity is the beauty," Constance stated, not with bitterness, but with the simple finality of a mathematical proof. "I am the balance sheet. The Duke will not find what he is looking for in me. He will find a passable face and a good name. That is all he needs. Now go upstairs and see what can be done with your hair." Constance did not move. She looked at her aunt, at the desperate avarice in her eyes, and felt a familiar, weary stillness settle over her. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Protests changed nothing. Only facts held any power. "There is no money for a new gown," she said plainly. "And my blue merino is not fit for a ducal ball. The hem is frayed beyond repair." Lavinia's face tightened. "Wear your mother's pearls. You sold them last autumn to pay for Felicity's visit to Bath." The slap was not a surprise. It was a punctuation mark her aunt often used when facts became inconvenient. The sting bloomed across Constance's cheek, hot and sharp. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply held her aunt's furious gaze until Lavinia, unnerved by the silence, looked away first. "You will go," her aunt said, her voice trembling with rage. "If I have to drag you there myself." But Constance knew she would not go. The refusal was not an act of rebellion, it was an act of preservation. To present herself at that ball, a pauper in a mended dress, would be a humiliation she could not afford. Dignity was the only currency she had left, and she would not squander it. Later that evening, she took a single sheet of plain paper and penned a note of regret. Her penmanship was clear and precise, devoid of flourish. She cited a prior family commitment, a polite and impenetrable lie. She sealed it not with wax, but with a simple fold, and had the stable boy deliver it to Kestrel Chase the next morning. She had refused the Duke. The matter, she thought, was closed. She spent the day of the ball not in a flurry of silks and perfumes, but in the small, dusty room she used as an office. Before her lay the household ledgers, books filled with her neat, careful script. She was tracing the slow, steady hemorrhage of her inheritance, the mounting debts her aunt incurred. A dressmaker in Marley, a milliner, a purveyor of French gloves for Felicity. Each entry was a small nail in the coffin of her own future. She worked until her fingers were smudged with ink and her back ached. In the corner of the room, on a small shelf, sat a thick book bound in worn leather. An illustrated compendium of English flora. Its spine was broken, the pages threatening to spill from their moorings. It was her father's last gift to her. Sometimes, when the numbers became too grim, she would open it and lose herself in the delicate, hand-painted illustrations of primrose and foxglove, a world of quiet, ordered beauty, far from the grasping chaos of her life. Tonight, she did not allow herself the comfort. She worked until the last candle guttered out, the distant sound of carriage wheels on the main road the only reminder of the world of balls and dukes she had refused to enter. 3 days later, a carriage bearing a ducal crest rolled up the gravel drive of the modest Hollis residence. It was not an invitation it carried. It was the Duke himself. Gideon Devereux did not wait to be announced. He was shown into the morning room where Lavinia and Felicity were practicing their watercolors. He was a tall man, built not with the softness of the gentry, but with the hard lines of a soldier. His face was severe, his eyes a shade of gray that seemed to absorb the light, and he moved with an unnerving economy of motion. He was known as the Iron Duke, a man who had seen battle and returned a widower, emotionally sealed and utterly impervious to the charms of the county's young ladies. He gave Lavinia and Felicity a curt nod that was less a greeting and more an acknowledgement of their presence. "I am here to see Miss Constance Abbott," he said. His voice was low and carried the quiet authority of a man who never had to raise it. Lavinia, flustered and ecstatic, fluttered. "Your Grace, we are so honored. Constance is occupied with household matters. Felicity, dear, perhaps you could entertain the Duke?" Gideon's gaze swept over Felicity's pretty, vacant face and dismissed it in an instant. "My business is with her sister." Constance was summoned from her ledgers. She entered the room in her plain gray dress, a smudge of ink still on her knuckle. She did not curtsy deeply or offer a blushing apology for her appearance. She simply met his gaze and waited. "Miss Abbott," he began, dispensing with all pleasantry. "You were invited to my home. You declined." "I was unable to attend, Your Grace," she replied, her voice even. "So your note said." He took a step closer. He was studying her, not as a man studies a woman, but as a general might study a map, looking for strengths and weaknesses. 50 ladies have accepted my invitations this year. They have worn their finest gowns, displayed their prettiest smiles, and demonstrated their accomplishments. They have all been unsuitable. Lavinia's breath hitched. Felicity looked confused. "I did not build my fortune on charm, Miss Abbott," the Duke continued, his eyes fixed on hers. "I built it on facts, on evidence. I have a need, and I seek to fill it. I require a duchess for Kestrel Chase, not a decoration, not a hostess for vapid parties. I require a partner, someone to restore order." He paused. 2 days ago, I was in Marley, at the office of Mr. Ellery, the solicitor. I was in the adjoining room. The door was ajar. I overheard a conversation. Constance felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She remembered the meeting. Her aunt had sent her to demand another advance against her father's trust. Constance had gone, not to ask, but to present the accounts. to prove, with brutal clarity, that they were on the brink of insolvency, and that further credit was impossible. "I heard a woman's voice," the Duke said, his gaze unwavering, "presenting a case not with tears or pleading, but with figures, with dates, with a command of fact that Mr. Ellery, a professional man of law, could not refute. I saw a woman fighting not for a new bonnet, but for the survival of her house, armed only with a ledger and the truth. That woman was you." He was not offering a compliment. It was a statement of observed fact. "The county thinks I'm looking for a pretty face," he said, a flicker of something like contempt in his tone. "I am not. I am looking for a mind, for competence, for a character that does not bend under pressure." He looked from her steady eyes to her ink-stained fingers. "You refused to attend my ball. You did not play the game. That, Miss Abbott, was the most interesting thing any woman has done in this county in a year." Lavinia was staring, her mouth agape. This was not how a courtship was meant to proceed. There was no poetry, no flirtation. It was as romantic as the reading of a will. "I have a proposition for you," Gideon Devereux said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a private contract spoken in a public room. "It is not a courtship. It is an offer of alliance. I am in need of a duchess of your specific talents. You are in need of rescue from this." His gaze flicked around the room, taking in the worn furniture, the desperate gentility, the simmering tyranny of her aunt. "I will settle your late father's debts in their entirety. I will provide a dowry of £10,000 for your sister, to be administered by a neutral trustee. In exchange, you will marry me. You will become the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. Your duties will be the full administration of the household, the accounts, and the estate management. You will have my complete authority in these matters. In return, you will have my protection, a title, and financial security beyond question. It will be a contract, entered into by two sensible parties for mutual benefit. No pretense of affection will be required on either side." The silence in the room was absolute. Felicity looked as though she might faint. Lavinia's eyes were wide, with a frantic, greedy calculation. A duke. £10,000. It was a fairy tale, but a strange, cold version of one. Constance looked at Gideon Devereux. He was not offering her a dream. He was offering her an escape, a position, a life's work. He was not looking at her as a woman to be desired, but as an asset to be acquired. It was not insulting. It was, in its own way, the highest form of respect she had ever been shown. He saw her. Not her face or her name, but the substance of her, the part she had honed in silence and obscurity. She thought of the endless columns of figures, of her aunt's rages, of the slow, grinding erosion of her own life. She thought of the broken-spined book on her shelf, a symbol of a past she could not protect. This man was offering her a fortress. "The terms are plain," she said, her voice steady. "They are," he confirmed. "And my authority over the household and estates would be absolute?" "Absolute. You would answer only to me." She gave a single, decisive nod. "I accept your proposition, Your Grace." He did not smile. His expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It was not warmth. It was something harder and more respectful. It was the satisfaction of a problem solved. "Good," he said. "We will be married by special license in 1 week. Be ready." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving a stunned silence and the scent of cold, clean air in his wake. Constance Abbott, the girl who refused the ball, was to become the Duchess of Iron. The contract had been sealed. Kestrel Chase was less a house than a monument to grief. It stood vast and silent on its hill, its many windows like vacant eyes staring out over acres of neglected parkland. Inside, the air was cold, thick with the smell of dust and beeswax. Footsteps echoed in the cavernous hall, and the servants moved like ghosts, their expressions shuttered and wary. The former duchess, it was whispered, had been the light of the house, and when she had died 5 years prior, the duke had returned from the war and extinguished every lamp. Constance arrived with a single trunk containing her few gray dresses and her father's broken-spined book of flowers. Gideon met her at the door. He was dressed not in ducal finery, but in the practical clothes of a landowner. "Welcome to Kestrel Chase, madam," he said. It was not a welcome. It was a transfer of title. "The housekeeper is Mrs. Hannah. She will show you to your rooms. The ledgers are in the estate office. I will expect your preliminary report in 1 week." He did not offer her his arm. He did not touch her. He simply turned and strode towards the office, leaving her in the echoing silence of the main hall. A woman with a face like a weathered stone and a stiff black dress stepped forward. This was Hannah, the housekeeper. Her eyes, small and sharp, took in Constance's plain traveling dress and single trunk with an expression that hovered between pity and contempt. "This way, Your Grace," she said, the title sounding foreign and ill-fitting on her tongue. The Duchess's apartments were a suite of opulent, cold rooms. The furniture was shrouded in white dust cloths, the air stale. It was a museum to a dead woman. Constance walked to the window and looked out. The gardens were a riot of weeds, the stone paths green with moss. It was a perfect mirror of the man who owned it, grand, imposing, and utterly devoid of life. "I will not be sleeping here," Constance said, turning back to the housekeeper. "These were the former Duchess's rooms. They should be preserved as they are. Have a smaller guest chamber prepared for me. Something simple, near the estate office." Hannah's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. She had expected the new bride to demand the finest suite. "As you wish, Your Grace." Constance did not begin by issuing grand orders. She did not demand the dust cloths be removed or the silver polished. Her first day was spent in silence, walking. She walked through every corridor of the great house, her hand trailing lightly on the dusty banisters. She walked the kitchens, where a skeleton staff worked with a kind of joyless efficiency. She learned their names: Peg in the scullery, young Wilf who turned the spit. She asked them not what they did, but what they needed. Her second day was spent in the estate office, a room smelling of old paper and dry rot. The ledgers were a disaster, a tangle of haphazard entries and questionable expenses. The third day, she found the library. It was here, in this vast, cold room, that she found the soul of the house, or what was left of it. Thousands of books lined the walls, but a fine layer of dust coated everything. On a large table, covered by a sheet, lay the late Duchess's Passion, a collection of botanical albums filled with exquisite drawings and pressed flowers. They were beginning to suffer from the damp. That evening, Gideon found her there. The sun had set, and the room was filled with long shadows. Constance had not lit a lamp. She was standing by the table, the sheet pulled back, her fingers hovering over a drawing of a wild orchid. She had her own damaged book open beside the Duchess's album. "The damp will ruin these," she said, without turning. She had heard his silent approach. "They were my wife's," he said. His voice was flat, containing no grief, only fact. "I know." She finally looked at him. "She was a student of the art. Her pressings are perfect. She understood that you must capture the color before the life has entirely fled." She touched the spine of her own book. "My father taught me the rudiments of the craft. This was his." He looked from the opulent, pristine albums of his late wife to the battered, broken book that belonged to his new one. He said nothing. "The house is cold, Your Grace," she said, changing the subject. "The staff are running it on memory, not on instruction. The coal allowance for the kitchens is insufficient. The baker's contract from the village is twice the proper rate. The bailiff, Mr. Farrow, has been purchasing feed from his own cousin at an inflated price. These are the preliminary findings of my report." She was all business, no sentiment. No complaint about her cold rooms or the staff's suspicion. Just facts. Just the work. He nodded slowly. "Correct the contracts. Dismiss the bailiff. Do what you must. I will need your signature to break the contract with the baker. Bring it to me in the morning." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "The library. My late wife's collection. You have an interest." It was not a question. "I do." "See to it then," he said. "Protect it from the damp." And he was gone. It was the first crack in the ice. He had given her something that was not in their contract. He had given her a trust. The next day, Constance had a small, dry fire built in the library grate. She had the windows cleaned to let in the winter sun. She began the painstaking work of interleaving the album pages with oilcloth to protect them from moisture. She did not work on the household ledgers in the estate office anymore. She worked from the great table in the library, surrounded by the silent, beautiful work of the woman who had come before her. Slowly, quietly, the house began to change. Constance's quiet competence was a puzzle the staff could not solve. She did not shout or demand. She observed, and then she acted. She noticed young Wilf had a persistent cough and had the physician from Marley attend to him. She discovered Peg in the scullery had a talent for herbs and, after reviewing the accounts, gave her a small budget to restore the kitchen garden. One day, the smell of fresh bread, rich and warm, filled the cold corridors for the first time in 5 years. Hannah, the grim housekeeper, found Constance in the kitchens, her hands dusted with flour, learning the old ovens from the cook. Hannah said nothing, but the next morning, a vase with a single, perfect snowdrop appeared on the desk in the library. It was an unspoken offering of fealty. Gideon observed it all from a distance. He saw the weeds being cleared from the garden paths. He heard the faint sound of laughter from the servants' hall. He came home one evening to find the main hall lit not by a single candle, but by a dozen, their light glinting on polished wood and clean glass. It was not opulent, it was simply alive. He found himself drawn to the library each evening. He would not speak to Constance, but would sit in a worn armchair by the fire, ostensibly reading his own papers, while she worked at the great table. He watched her hands, the precise, careful way she handled the fragile pages of the albums. He watched the focused line of her brow, the quiet intelligence in her eyes. She never tried to draw him into conversation. She never asked about his late wife. She simply worked, a calm, steady presence in the heart of his silent house. One night, he saw her pause. She was looking at a page in her own battered book. He rose and walked to the table. "What is it?" She pointed to a pressed flower, its color faded to a pale ghost. "A bee orchid, from a meadow near my childhood home. The meadow was sold for pasture 5 years ago. The orchids are all gone now." There was no self-pity in her voice, only a quiet melancholy for a beauty that had been lost. "There are bee orchids on the south-facing slope of Kestrel Chase," he said, his voice unexpectedly soft. "They bloom in May. I will show you." Constance looked up at him, surprised. It was the first promise of a shared future he had ever offered, however small. It was not part of the contract. It was something else entirely, something that was beginning to grow, as quiet and as patient as a flower, in the cold, still rooms of the house. And it was this small, burgeoning warmth that the coming storm would seek to extinguish. The news of the changes at Kestrel Chase traveled quickly through the county. Whispers turned a plain, competent woman into a cunning sorceress who had bewitched the grieving Duke. No one was more venomous in these tellings than Miss Philippa Crane. The daughter of a wealthy landowner, Philippa was beautiful, polished, and had considered herself the undisputed frontrunner for the ducal title. Constance's sudden elevation from impoverished spinster to duchess was a public humiliation she could not endure. Her fury found a willing accomplice in Lavinia Hollis, who felt cheated out of the ducal access and control she had craved. Their campaign began with social snubs. At Sunday service, Philippa and her circle would turn their backs as Constance passed. Invitations to afternoon teas and dinners at neighboring estates, which should have flooded the new duchess, never arrived. Constance bore the slights with the same composure she applied to everything. She had not married the Duke for social acceptance. She had her work. The quiet approval of Hannah and the slow thawing of her husband were worth more to her than the esteem of the entire county. But the opposition was not content with mere ostracism. Seeing that social pressure had no effect, they escalated their attack. The dismissed bailiff, Mr. Farrow, bitter at the loss of his lucrative position, became their instrument. Philippa, whose father had dealings with Farrow, met with him in secret. She knew from county gossip that the new duchess had taken personal control of all the estate finances. An idea, cruel and precise, began to form. One afternoon, Gideon returned from a ride to find a visitor waiting for him. It was Mr. Farrow, his face a mask of false sincerity and concern. "Your Grace," he said, bowing low, "I come here against my better judgment, but my conscience would not allow me to remain silent. I fear the estate is being mismanaged." Gideon's face was unreadable. "State your purpose, Farrow." Farrow, emboldened, produced a ledger. It was one of the household account books. "I retained a copy of my final month's accounts for my own protection. I have seen discrepancies since. I fear Her Grace, in her inexperience, is being taken advantage of. Or worse." He opened the book to a specific page. He pointed to an entry. "This payment, £500, transferred to a bank in London. The notation says it is for the dowry of Miss Felicity Abbott." Gideon looked at the entry. The handwriting was a passable imitation of Constance's neat script. "But, Your Grace," Farrow continued, his voice dripping with feigned regret, "I happen to know
that Miss Abbott's dowry is being held in trust by Mr. Ellery in Mali. I made some quiet inquiries. This is a second secret payment. A personal fund, it would seem. The implication was clear. Constance was embezzling money, siphoning off her husband's fortune under the guise of providing for her sister. It was a brilliant accusation, playing on the stereotype of the grasping, poor relation. Gideon took the ledger. He studied the page for a long, silent minute. The ink. The numbers. Pharaoh watched him, a bead of sweat on his upper lip. He had expected an explosion from the famously cold Duke, an immediate summons, a confrontation. Instead, Gideon closed the book. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mr. Pharaoh," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You may go." Pharaoh hesitated, confused. "Your Grace, I believe—" "I have heard you," Gideon cut him off, his gray eyes as hard as granite. "Your concern is noted. Now leave my house." Pharaoh scurried away, uncertain whether his scheme had succeeded or failed. That evening, the warmth that had begun to seep into Kestrel Chase vanished. The air grew cold again. Gideon did not come to the library. Constance felt his absence like a physical blow. She told herself it did not matter. Theirs was a contract. His trust was not a required clause. But the lie was thin and brittle. She had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, to the silent companionship that had become the bedrock of her new life. He found her later, not in the library, but in the small, simple chamber she had chosen for her own. He did not knock. He entered and closed the door behind him. In his hand, he held the ledger. He did not look angry. He looked sealed again. The Iron Duke was back. He did not accuse her. He did not shout. He simply opened the ledger to the damning page and laid it on the small table beside her. "Explain this," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut her more deeply than any rage. The two words were a chasm opening between them. Explain this. The quiet implication of guilt, the demand for a defense. All the progress, all the shared silence and slow-growing respect seemed to evaporate in that moment. For the first time since her arrival, Constance felt the true precariousness of her position. She was the Duchess, but she was also the hired manager, and she was under suspicion. She looked down at the ledger. She saw the entry for £500. She saw the careful, malicious forgery of her own hand, and she felt a cold anger, precise and pure. This was an attack not just on her position, but on the very core of her identity, her competence, her honesty. She did not look at him. She looked only at the book. Her mind, that remarkable instrument of memory and order, began to work. She did not panic. She did not weep. She analyzed. "The ink," she said, her voice low and steady. "It is gall ink, but of a cheaper quality than the one I use. See the way it has feathered slightly at the edges of the F. My supplier is from London. This ink is from the stationer in Marley." Some looked up at him then, her eyes clear and direct. The hurt was there, a deep, wounded thing, but it was shielded by a wall of cold, hard fact. The handwriting is a good imitation, but the pressure is wrong. The forger presses down on the upstrokes. I do not. She took a small, private notebook from a drawer.
It was her own daily log, a habit from her old life she had never abandoned. She flipped through the pages. The date of this supposed transaction is October the 12th. On that day, you and I spent the entire afternoon, from 1 o'clock until 5, inspecting the drainage tiles in the north pasture after the storm. The bailiff's cottage, where you are standing, is a 2-hour ride from there. I was not here. I was with you. She laid her notebook open next to the ledger. Her entry for October the 12th was clear. 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., north pasture with GD to assess flood damage. Tiles number 4 and number 7 blocked. Wilf to be sent with rods tomorrow. Dinner at 7 p.m. He was silent. The evidence was irrefutable. Her word against a forgery, backed by her own meticulous records and his own memory. The crisis hung in the balance, resting not on a passionate plea of innocence, but on the cold, undeniable authority of a well-kept logbook. Gideon looked from the forged ledger to her private notebook. He looked at her face, pale and composed, her eyes holding his without fear. He saw the truth in her, not as an emotional appeal, but as an unassailable fact, as solid and real as the stone walls of his house. The coldness in his expression did not melt, but it changed. The ice of suspicion cracked, replaced by a slow-burning anger, directed not at her, but at those who had sought to frame her. He reached out and closed her small notebook. Then he closed the ledger. "I see," he said. The 2 words were the opposite of his earlier demand. They were an acceptance, an apology, an alliance. The chasm was closed. He looked at her, and for the first time he seemed to see the wound he had inflicted. "They sought to use my own past against me," he said, his voice quiet. "They assumed I would believe the worst. They were mistaken." He paused. "I was, for a moment, also mistaken. For that, I ask your pardon. It was more intimate than any touch. The proud, silent Duke apologizing." Constance gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Forgiveness was not necessary. Belief was. "Who are they?" she asked. "Pharaoh was the instrument," he said, his voice hardening. "But the malice belongs to Philippa Crane. And, I suspect, to your aunt." A new resolve settled in his eyes, cold and sharp as a shard of steel. "They wished to stage a public drama to ruin you. Very well. They shall have their drama. But they will not be writing the final act." He picked up the forged ledger. "This was their weapon against you. Now it will be ours against them." The contract of their marriage had been about management and security. In that moment, it became something more. It became a partnership. A conspiracy of 2 against a world of whispers and lies. The trap was about to be set. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The invitations from Kestrel Chase were the most coveted of the season. The Duke and his mysterious new Duchess were hosting a dinner. Not a ball, but an intimate gathering of the county's most influential figures. The guest list was a masterpiece of strategic cruelty. It included Philippa Crane and her father, Lavinia Hollis, and the venerable magistrate Yardley, a man whose judgment could make or break a reputation in the county. Philippa and Lavinia accepted with triumphant glee, assuming this was the moment the upstart Duchess would be publicly exposed and cast out. They arrived dressed in their finest, armor for the victory they believed was at hand. Kestrel Chase was transformed. It was no longer cold and silent. Every room on the ground floor was warmly lit, fires crackling in every hearth. The scent of rosemary and roasting meat filled the air. The servants, dressed in new livery, moved with a quiet pride. Constance stood beside her husband to receive their guests. She was not wearing gray. She wore a gown of deep emerald velvet, a color that brought out the hidden flecks of gold in her steady eyes. She wore no jewels except for a simple gold wedding band. She was not beautiful like Philippa, but she possessed a stillness and a presence that made the other woman's polished glamour seem brittle and shallow. Dinner was a tense affair. Philippa and Lavinia directed a stream of thinly veiled barbs at Constance, commenting on the novel arrangements of the household and the surprising choice of menu. Constance met each comment with a calm, polite smile, refusing to be drawn. Gideon remained impassive, a thundercloud waiting to break. The moment came with the dessert. As the port was being passed, Philippa leaned forward, her voice carrying across the table. "One hears such worrying tales of estate management these days, Your Grace," she said, addressing Gideon but looking at Constance. "It is so easy for those with sudden authority to make errors, costly ones. One must be so vigilant." It was the signal. Gideon placed his wine glass down with a quiet click that silenced the table. "Your concern is timely, Miss Crane," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I have, in fact, been reviewing a matter of financial discrepancy myself." He nodded to the head footman, who stepped forward and placed the forged ledger on the polished table beside the Duke. A murmur went through the room. "This is one of our household account books," Gideon announced. He opened it to the page with the fraudulent entry. "An entry was brought to my attention. A payment of £500, supposedly for my sister-in-law's dowry, but transferred to a private account." Lavinia Hollis gasped, a perfect performance of shock and horror. Philippa's eyes glittered with anticipation. "The entry," Gideon continued, his gaze sweeping the table, "appears to be in my wife's hand." Constance sat perfectly still, her face pale but composed. Magistrate Yardley leaned forward, his expression grim. "However," the Duke said, letting the word hang in the air, "the Duchess has a rather precise memory." He looked at Constance, and for a fleeting moment, the entire table saw the look that passed between them. It was a look of absolute, unshakable unity. She pointed out that on the day in question, she and I were together, miles from here. So I began to ask myself, if the Duchess did not make this entry, who did? He produced a second book, Constance's small private log. "My wife, you see, keeps meticulous records." He then produced a third document. "And so I took the liberty of consulting an expert, a Mr. Nash from London, one of the foremost authorities on ink and penmanship. Mr. Nash?" A side door opened, and a small, scholarly man with spectacles entered the room. He bowed to the Duke. "Mr. Nash," Gideon said, "would you be so kind as to share your findings regarding this ledger entry?" Mr. Nash cleared his throat. "Certainly, Your Grace. The entry is a forgery, a competent one, but a forgery nonetheless. The ink is of a different composition to the rest of the page, and the pen strokes, while superficially similar, show evidence of hesitation and tracing inconsistent with the Duchess's fluid hand." A collective gasp went through the room. Philippa Crane's face had gone ashen. Her father looked at her in horror. "A forgery," Gideon repeated, his voice like ice. "Intended to cast my wife as a thief. A crime committed, I discovered, by a disgruntled former bailiff, a Mr. Farrow. As if on cue, the main doors to the dining room opened. 2 stout footmen entered, holding a pale, sweating Mr. Farrow between them. The disgraced bailiff looked wildly around the room, his eyes landing on Philippa. "Mr. Farrow," the Duke said calmly, "you have already confessed to the forgery. Now, tell this assembly who instructed you to do it. Who promised you remuneration and reinstatement for this act of slander?" Farrow trembled, his gaze fixed on Philippa's horrified face. He opened his mouth, and a pathetic, squeaking sound came out. It was Miss Crane," he stammered. She planned it all. She said the Duchess was a nobody, an upstart. She said we had to get rid of her." The silence that followed was devastating. Philippa Crane, the belle of the county, was exposed as a common criminal. Her father buried his face in his hands. But the drama was not yet over. Lavinia Hollis, seeing her ambitions and her ally utterly destroyed, finally broke. Her carefully constructed gentility shattered, revealing the raw greed beneath. "She deserves it!" Lavinia shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Constance. "The little gray mouse! She stole it all from my Felicity. It should have been Felicity who married him. She's the pretty one. Constance was nothing, a servant in my house. I fed her, I clothed her, and this is how she repays me? By stealing a duke and leaving us with nothing?" Her tirade, filled with years of resentment and thwarted ambition, laid bare the truth of Constance's life more completely than any accusation. It was not a defense of Philippa. It was a confession of her own cruelty. Constance finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through her aunt's screeching with the clarity of a bell. "You did not feed me, Aunt Lavinia," she said, her eyes fixed on the woman who had tormented her for years. "My father's trust fed us all. You did not clothe me. I wore my mother's altered gowns until they fell apart. I was not a servant in your house. I was its manager, its bookkeeper, and its salvation. And you were its greatest debt. You did not seek a duke for Felicity. You sought a fortune for yourself." Each sentence was a calm, devastating truth. There was no anger in her voice, only the quiet finality of a verdict delivered. Magistrate Yardley stood up, his face a mask of stern judgment. "Miss Crane, Mr. Farrow, you will consider yourselves under legal scrutiny. This is a matter of conspiracy and libel." He then turned his gaze to Constance, and his expression softened with respect. "Your Grace," he said, his voice booming in the silent room, "you have conducted yourself with a dignity and integrity that does you and your station immense credit. The county owes you an apology." The reckoning was complete. Philippa was ruined, Lavinia was disgraced, and Constance, the quiet girl from the back rooms, was vindicated in the full glare of the society that had scorned her. She had won, not with beauty or charm, but with competence, honesty, and the unwavering support of the man beside her. The last guest departed into the cold night, leaving behind a house that felt, for the first time, like a true sanctuary. The servants cleared the remnants of the dinner, their movements quiet, but suffused with a fierce, protective loyalty. The battle was over. Gideon did not speak. He simply held out his hand to Constance. She placed hers in it, and he led her from the dining room, through the now quiet hall, and into the library. A single fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the books and the polished wood. The room smelled of old leather and wood smoke. It was their room. Constance went to the window, looking out at the dark, sleeping parkland. She felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but also of peace. The ledgers were balanced. The accounts were settled. She heard him move behind her, but he did not speak. She felt the warmth of the fire on her back and the cool of the window pane near her hand. She waited. When he spoke, his voice was low, stripped of all its ducal authority, all its iron reserve. It was just the voice of a man. "The terms of our contract have been fulfilled," he said. She turned to face him. He was standing a few feet away, his face half in shadow, the firelight catching the hard lines of his jaw. "The estate is in order," he continued. "Your enemies are answered. My name is protected. You have done everything I asked of you, and more." He took a step closer. "You have brought this house back to life, Constance. You have brought me back to life." The use of her first name, spoken so softly in the quiet room, was an earthquake. It shattered the last remnants of their formal arrangement. He did not stand over her, a duke addressing his subordinate. He did what no one in her life had ever done. He yielded. He sank to one knee before her, on the worn Turkish rug in front of the fire. He was not a duke. He was not the master of Kestrel Chase. He was simply Gideon. And he was kneeling. He took her hand. His was large and warm, calloused from the reins of his horse, and it enveloped hers completely. He looked up at her. His gray eyes, which had held so much coldness and grief, now holding a different light. A steady, quiet, and overwhelming devotion. "The contract is void," he said plainly. "I am not interested in a duchess of convenience. I find myself in need of a wife, of a partner in all things. I wish to begin a marriage. With you, Constance. Not for the estate, not for the title. For me. For us. If you will have me." It was not a passionate, poetic outpouring. It was better. It was a plain-spoken declaration, as honest and as solid as he was. It was a choice freely offered. He was not rescuing her. He was asking to be her equal. Tears she had refused to shed for her aunt's cruelty, for the county's scorn, for the moment of doubt in his eyes, finally came. They were not tears of sadness or pain, but of a profound, earth-shattering relief. The release of a breath she had been holding her entire life. She knelt down to face him, so their eyes were level. She laid her other hand over his. "Yes," she whispered. The word was full of all the unspoken conversations they had shared over ledgers and books. "Yes, Gideon. Together." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, sealing this new contract not with ink and paper, but with a simple human touch. In the quiet, fire-lit library, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of a future, the Duke and his Duchess finally began their marriage. 1 year later, Kestrel Chase was a place transformed. The gardens bloomed in ordered profusion, the scent of roses and lavender drifting through the open windows. The house was filled with light and the quiet hum of a happy, well-run home. The staff, led by a smiling Hannah, served the Duke and Duchess with a devotion that went far beyond duty. Constance was walking the south-facing slope with Gideon, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. The emerald velvet gown was long gone, replaced by a simple dress of blue linen that matched the summer sky. She was pointing out the small, delicate heads of the bee orchids that dotted the hillside, just as he had promised she would see. He watched her, his face no longer a mask of iron, but softened with a deep, abiding contentment. A letter had arrived that morning from her sister. Felicity, humbled by her mother's public disgrace and her own fall from social grace, had married a respectable solicitor from a distant town. The £10,000 dowry, administered by Constance with scrupulous fairness, had secured her a comfortable, if not brilliant, match. The letter was tentative, apologetic, a fragile bridge being built across a chasm of past wrongs. Constance had read it with a sense of quiet closure. She would answer it. Forgiveness was a process, but peace was possible. Later that day, in the library, Gideon presented her with a gift. It was not jewelry. It was not a deed to a property. It was a book. She took it, her breath catching in her throat. It was her father's illustrated compendium of English flora. But it was no longer broken and battered. A master bookbinder had repaired it, clothing it in new, supple leather the color of rich earth. The tooling was simple, elegant, and strong. It felt solid and whole in her hands. She opened it. The familiar pages were all there, clean and secure. But there was a new page at the very beginning, a sheet of clean, heavy paper that had not been there before. Pressed in the center of the page was a single, perfect flower, a bee orchid, gathered that morning from the sunny slope of Kestrel Chase. A new specimen from a new home. A new beginning. Beneath it, in his strong, clear hand, Gideon had written 2 words. Constance. Together. She looked up at him, her heart full. The girl who had managed accounts in a dusty back room had balanced the books of her own life. The Duke, who had rejected 50 brides, had found the one who refused to be inspected. And in a quiet library, surrounded by the beauty of the past and the promise of the future, their story was not ending, but truly beginning. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.